Greetings, all! The release of Pokémon Legends Arceus has managed to present a breathtaking look at the Sinnoh region in an older time, a time where it was known as the Hisui region. A land far removed from the Sinnoh region as we know it, and yet at the same time just familiar enough to make it an adventure that veterans of the series and newcomers alike can enjoy together. However, for as wonderful as the region is, there does seem to be a major pressing issue with it all that is not directly addressed in any part of the game, yet must be a lingering question in the minds of all that play it. The land is truly different from Sinnoh, very different enough to say that while it is Sinnoh, something drastic has happened in order for it to become the region that players of Diamond, Pearl, their remakes, and Platinum are familiar with. Was it just gradual change, human-driven change, or something altogether different? Today, I'd like us to take a look at the history of the region and the geologic state of its existence to show you all how, as far as I'm concerned, the Sinnoh region is a consequence of a cataclysmic volcanic eruption, or perhaps a series of them, and that there may be a Pokémon to blame it all on.
In order to really understand just what is going on with the Hisui and Sinnoh regions in general, we need to take a step back first and take a look at the Hokkaido Prefecture, the area of Japan that the two regions are actually based on, in order to see the geologic background that set the stage for the transformation of Hisui into Sinnoh. Japan is a country known for its issues with earthquakes and volcanoes, and that isn't wholly surprising given the tectonic situation it is in. The northern stretch of Japan that Hokkaido lies on is situated on the Okhotsk Plate, bounded by the Amur Plate to the west and the Pacific Plate to the east. On both sides, it is bounded by what are called subduction zones, which are marked by the presence of thrust faults, or spaces where overhanging rock material is being forced upward against another slab of rock, as seen on this map, with the zones themselves involving one plate sinking beneath the other. On the west, there is an incipient subduction zone, meaning that the Amur Plate is just starting to sink beneath the Okhotsk Plate. And on the east, there is another subduction zone where the Pacific Plate is also sinking beneath the Okhotsk Plate, though it's a bit more complicated on that side because there's also the presence of strike, slip, or side-to-side motion on the outer eastern edge of the Okhotsk Plate, which creates a collision zone on that side of the plate. To put it simply, there is a part of it that is grinding against itself horizontally, which leads to thrust faulting on the southern edge of that collision zone, and wouldn't you know, the corner of that part, where the western part of the plate is overriding the eastern part and is thus being thrust upwards, is also right where Mount Coronet is. This is likely why the mountain exists at all.
As I mentioned just a bit ago, Japan is known for both earthquakes and volcanic activity, and in the special case of Hokkaido, this makes perfect sense. With subduction occurring at basically both sides, you have massive plates that are sinking below the plate that the prefecture lies upon, and this can create shallow earthquakes from the scraping of one plate beneath the other. This tends to produce powerful earthquakes that can be extremely damaging, and Japan more than has a history with the likes of that.
At the same time, this process puts a ton of heat and pressure on the plate that is being subducted downwards, and this can cause part of it to melt and turn into magma, which is more buoyant than the surrounding rock, and thus tends to rise up, forming volcanoes inland on the sides of the overriding plate, in this case, the Okhotsk Plate. Japan is part of the Ring of Fire, a string of volcanoes that run along the edge of the Pacific Plate where the plate interacts with the plates that surround its border, and indeed Japan is home to volcanoes as a consequence of the Pacific Plate subducting beneath it.
This is all well and good, you might say, but how does this connect to Hisui and Sinnoh? Well, let's take a look at their map and see where the connections can be found.
First of all, let's examine the most important aspect of the most iconic parts of the region, namely Lake Valor, Lake Verity, and Lake Acuity. Do you see something they have in common? If you guess that they are all seemingly quite circular, you are correct. And given that geology already established, this likely suggests that they were not formed like normal lakes would be. No. The circular form of them is indicative of a crater lake, specifically a volcanic crater lake, which are known for having this sort of circular form caused by the pouring of lava and ash, among other materials, onto the summit or flanks of a volcano from an eruption. Now it is true that this could be the result of a different process, but given it's not one, but 3 such lakes that share this form, and the possibility for volcanic activity is already established, it makes sense that this is likely the cause behind their creation, especially since we already know the region in-game does have volcanism due to the presence of Firespit Island and Stark Mountain, but we'll get to that in time. This speaks to the Hisui and Sinnoh regions having a long history of volcanic events in the past, and from the look of modern-day Sinnoh, that history is still very much ongoing.
We can go even further than this and state that they were likely formed from what are known as composite volcanoes, or more commonly, stratovolcanoes.
This is a very common feature to see on the formation of an overriding plate at a subduction zone, especially given that there is continental crust involved in the case, which changes the viscosity of magma that travels through it, loading it with silica that makes it more sluggish in its movements. The reason for this is that silica molecules tend to bunch up together and don't flow freely, so the resulting lava that exits the surface is thick and sticky, forming a classic volcanic structure as you might have seen in books and other media as children. The sticky nature of the lava is also what makes stratovolcanoes deadly, as the thick material may become too viscous to flow properly and form a plug, when rising pressure from magma upwelling beneath it can eventually burst through in a devastating eruption of lava and ash, leaving behind layers of both materials around it to gradually build up over time. In the case of the lakes though, these three volcanoes have long since been buried and eroded away, leaving just a central island in the center that likely is the remnants of the volcanic plug that ceased their eruptions, while the craters formed from past eruptions have filled up with water before becoming standing lakes. Firespit Island in the past and Stark Mountain in the present also clearly are stratovolcanoes in structure, which helps support this conclusion further. And if it couldn't get any better, the legendary Pokémon Heatran, the Lava Dome Pokémon, who dwells in both Firespit Island in the past and Stark Mountain in the present, gets its name from dwelling inside of lava domes, which are the exclusive byproduct of viscous magma and lava and tend to form at convergent plate boundaries, just like what is seen in the Hisui and Sinnoh regions, with the potential to become stratovolcanoes in time. As a last note there, we can also safely assume that these are not calderas, because the walls of calderas tend to collapse unevenly, and again, given that we're working with three different lakes that have the same perfect shape, it is less likely that they just happen to be calderas that didn't collapse or otherwise formed perfectly round lakes. With the background geology of the area now set, we can address the fact that the terrain of much of the Hisui region is different from that of modern Sinnoh, and not by a little bit, mind you. There are some rather drastic changes between the two eras, especially for there apparently being less than 200 years of history between the two worlds.
How exactly do you change so much in such a short period of time, especially when it seems that, in the lore, the Diamond and Pearl clans have survived in the Hisui region for an extremely long period of time all on their own?
Take Firespit Island as a massive example. Given that it is the site of an active stratovolcano in the time of the Hisui region, many point to it being the past version of Stark Mountain and leave it at that. The problem with that is that it can't be Stark Mountain, because it is simply too far south for it to be Stark Mountain. However, it is in the perfect position to be the future site of Sinnoh Victory Road, and given how stratovolcanoes tend to have networks of passageways within them from branches of magma working their way into the underlying rock and accumulated materials, it isn't that far-fetched to imagine the frozen and hollowed-out interior of the structure after it goes extinct becoming the cavernous Victory Road, and the flanks the site of the Sinnoh Pokemon League. Even maps clearly show this, as Stark Mountain and the surrounding battle zone are farther to the north. So why exactly do so many people get this mixed up? Well, the simplest answer is also the easiest one to observe and confirm. In the time of the Hisui region, the area simply didn't exist yet, and this isn't isolated to just this particular example. There are several instances where the locations of certain features and locations in the Sinnoh region do not match up well at all with the maps of the land given for the Hisui region, such as Jubilife City. To that, there are two major things to consider, the first being the fact that the tectonic activity responsible for the three lakes of the Hisui and Sinnoh regions, as well as all the volcanic activity and thrust faulting, is still ongoing, even in Hokkaido, so it isn't wholly surprising that the entire area is still geologically active and thus still undergoing changes with continual deformation and alteration to the landscape. However, there is yet another problem here that is quite obvious: the time frame.
It's no surprise to anyone versed in geology that a lot of changes that involve plate tectonics tend to occur quite slowly in terms of human perspectives, and this is because there is a disconnect in some between normal time and what we call geologic time. While both seem to operate the same, the difference is the scale, as while for a human, a few years or 10 might seem like a long period of time, but in geologic time, that is merely the blink of an eye, as it operates on the scale of thousands or millions or even billions of years.
And reshaping a region like we see with Hisui and Sinnoh cannot really occur over the span of less than 200 years with normal geologic conditions at play. So what exactly is going on? Well, to that there is a possible explanation, and while it might not have concrete IRL evidence in its favor, it is also the only thing that can really be concluded. A lot of the land is likely being shaped by events involving legendary Pokémon. To give credit here, the Sinnoh region is not only home to powerful creatures like Regigigas that are said to be able to move continents with their bodies, but also the creation trio of Palkia, Dialga, and Giratina, and between them and the rest of those native to the region, it isn't that hard to imagine them somehow exerting an influence that has sped up or perhaps just flat out altered the way the region is shaped. Though details on that would require a full analysis of the terrain change between Hisui and Sinnoh, and that is best left for another time. The focus here is what exactly caused the overall changes to the land between Hisui and Sinnoh, and for that, we now take a look back to Stark Mountain. Specifically, the events that likely were involved in its creation.
As established, Stark Mountain is clearly a stratovolcano, not just some circumstantial evidence in the form of all the other known volcanic sites in the regions being made from the same type of volcanic structure, but also from the fact that its very interior and the presence of Heatran clearly shows it to have a form that is much more like a stratovolcano than any other major type of volcano.
But as we also just noted in the Hisui region, it and the rest of the battle zone do not seem to exist yet. So the question then becomes how exactly one formed there in the first place, and the question has an obviously simple but important answer. It literally was just made there. While it might not seem so simple at first, there are many cases throughout history of volcanoes forming underwater before eventually breaching the surface. The islands of Hawaii are a great example, as the island chain is the result of volcanic activity spewing out a lot of material over time that is built up to form the islands as we see them today. And again, given the location of the area, it's part of an excellent tectonic situation for Stark Mountain's creation to be possible, given it is still on the Okhotsk plate with the rest of the Hisui and Sinnoh regions, despite being underwater in some form or another in the past. However, with this said, there is a major difference between this location and Hawaii, as the islands of Hawaii are made from shield volcanoes, which have magma and lava that is a lot less viscous and thus form sheets in effusive eruptions, meaning that the lava comes out in sheets and flows readily to form a wide structure. Stratovolcanoes do not. Because the magma inside of them is much more viscous and stickier, there's a greater chance of it effectively locking up or forming a plug as it becomes too thick to readily flow outwards, and this plug can create a pressure situation where more magma might be flowing up into the space, but cannot escape because it is stuck. This dam can be broken either through the plug or some other part of the volcano's structure, but because of the immense pressure that is needed to do so, it results in the release of an eruption of material from inside being much more explosive in nature, creating terrifying events that can be both a fright to many and the end of life for those caught in the destructive path of such eruptions. And relatively recently, the eruptions near the island chain of Tonga within Oceania showed the effects that such an explosive eruption could have on any land there's nearby, and the results are indeed utterly devastating. As such, whenever Stark Mountain was formed from an underwater explosion, the results would likely have been deadly. How deadly, you might ask? Well, to put it bluntly, if we take a close look at the events that likely would have transpired, we can see that, in practice, quite a few differences between the Hisui and Sinnoh regions can be explained by the effects of a catastrophic volcanic eruption. But before we get to that, there is one final aspect to all of this that needs to be addressed regarding the eruptions that likely formed everything, and that's what actually comes out of a stratovolcano when it erupts.
Most are aware of how lava comes out of volcanoes, and is often the attribute of an eruption you'd likely think is the biggest thing to fear. But when it comes to stratovolcanoes, this is actually far from the truth.
As I discussed already, stratovolcanoes are constructs made from piled up layers of lava and ash among other materials, and it's the ash that is actually the biggest threat to fear in the long run. Ash itself in this context is essentially microscopic shards of glass that are light enough they can be carried in the air, and aside from being deadly to breathe in, given that you'd literally be inhaling glass into your lungs, it can have a number of both positive and negative effects on an environment. For negatives, just to name a few, ash can actually smother life in general and suffocate it to death. It can alter the chemical makeup of terrain and alter how it functions and is structured. It can reflect sunlight in the atmosphere, which can result in global cooling that affects climate and the way that things like crops grow and develop. And they can spread for great distances if they get high enough into the atmosphere, which means that their effects can spread far beyond the reach of whatever source generated the substance. Moreover, it can even be spread through what is called a pyroclastic flow, which is essentially a debris cloud of hot ash and rock that moves at incredible speeds from a volcanic source across any surface like a liquid, effectively incinerating and covering everything it touches in seething hot ash. However, ash does have one important benefit in that it typically contains high concentrations of phosphorus, potassium, calcium, boron, and other elements that assist in plant growth, making it a potent fertilizer that can help facilitate greater plant growth.
With that said, if everything we have stated so far is in fact the case, and Stark Mountain is the result of a severe underwater volcanic eruption, what kinds of effects could it have ultimately had on the Hisui region's geography and its biota?
To start, let's take a look at the creatures that could have likely been affected the most by such an eruption, namely the unique Hisuian variants and species of Pokémon that are no longer in existence in the present Sinnoh region. If the Hisui region was indeed struck by a powerful volcanic eruption, or a series of them from a stratovolcano, there are at least a few species known that would have been likely affected by it. The introduction of ash and the chemicals associated with it could have affected the chemistry of the terrain and the availability of surface materials, covering up or otherwise altering them, which could then explain why Hisuian Sliggoo, Hisuian Goodra, Hisuian Quillfish, Overquill, and Ursaluna are no longer in existence, as unique water sources impede within the Crimson Mirelands, among some other places, could have been altered enough to rob them of the chemicals contained within them that would facilitate evolution in the first place, keeping Goomy, Quillfish, and Ursaring from having the materials they need to actually evolve. This could even potentially involve covering up known deposits of black augurite, thus also potentially explaining the absence of Cleavor in modern Sinnoh. Additionally, given that Stark Mountain in the present day is the only active volcano in the region, it is possible that the eruption could have shifted underground connecting points between the source of the magma and the volcanic structures, which would in turn not only explain why Firespit Island is now little more than a hollow cavern, its magma supply cut off, but also could explain the eventual disappearance of the members of the Hisuian Growlithe family from the typical habitat on the coast close to said extinct volcano. Moreover, if the amount of ash released into the air caused a volcanic winter, meaning that it caused the overall climate to drop in temperature, it would also explain why, of the four members of the forces of nature, Enamorus is the only one that has not reappeared in public viewing anywhere else in the world as we know it at the current time, as it is known that it hates the cold, and would likely have vacated the Hisui region if the cooling was severe enough to impair the emergence of spring-like weather over long periods of time. The presence of significant ashfall could have further altered the landscape by creating an environment with much richer soil as a whole. This is quite evident just by looking at the Sinnoh region today. As compared to the Hisui region, it is a far more heavily forested land and seems to have recovered enough that one would normally never be able to tell that the landscape had been altered by volcanic activity between now and the time of the Hisui region. On the one hand, the quick recovery could at least partially be linked to the known presence of shaman within the area, but even then you'd likely expect there to just be more flower fields and not such vast forests. The infusion of massive concentrations of vital nutrients and minerals into the soil from ash, however, could make this result much more likely, and possibly in turn explain why some areas from Hisui, like the majority of the Crimson Mirelands, have been rendered almost unrecognizable today. Taking this one step further, the numerous ruins that once existed in the Hisui region have seemingly been destroyed or covered up, and even Spear Pillar, as has been clearly shown, has been stripped of much of its remaining color from when it was the Temple of Sinnoh, and the broken columns are visibly worn. Given that there is less than 2 centuries of time between Hisui and Sinnoh, and yet the color of the temple lasted for much longer since its initial creation, it would only make sense that some sort of abrasive material, like ash, could be responsible for eroding away or at least covering up the once vibrant colors of the temple.
Within all of this, however, there is one final effect that I would like to bring up regarding the changes that could have been made to Hisui to make it into Sinnoh, and sadly it is also perhaps the most personal of all.
The Hisui region, as seen in Pokémon Legends Arceus, is filled with only a limited number of people, but careful viewers will have noticed that a large portion of the major characters introduced in the games are likely the ancestors of many characters from games set in modern times, And while that makes sense for those connected to the Sinnoh region, there are also many that connect to characters from many other regions. Moreover, we can see that the Hisui region has a very deep, rich history to it that is known by the members of the Diamond and Pearl clans, among other groups, yet there is very little information available from those times to inform on said groups. Even the ruins that once dotted the landscape have seemingly vanished, so what is going on here? Sadly, the truth of the matter is likely twofold, and would have likely resulted from the onset of volcanic activity at the future Stark Mountain. As is done with most towns and cities that live in the face of the threat of severe volcanic eruptions, it is likely that many would have escaped from the Hisui region and gone to other regions in order to build a new life where the danger posed by an eruption or several would not be present in their lives. And those that chose to stay? Well, they are likely the only ones that managed to make it through it all alive, surviving whatever kind of devastation was wreaked. In the face of this, it is in turn possible that this would have fractured the present tribes and groups in Hisui and forced them to form a new life, leaving the legends of the clans and much of ancient Sinnoh to be lost over time, all records of their existence seemingly destroyed or otherwise simply forgotten. This loss of information on the truth of the region would have profound effects over the following centuries, and today, there is little to no trace left of the Hisui region as Legends Arceus portrays it, leaving a bittersweet taste to have finally learned the truth behind the history of the Sinnoh region, but at the cost of understanding why so much of the region no longer exists as it once did.
With all of this laid out, it is a sad fate that Stark Mountain is likely the volcano that reshaped the region of Hisui into Sinnoh in a devastating way. But there is still one last question left to consider.
Stratovolcanoes take time to build over subsequent eruptions, and given that there is but a glimmer of geologic time involved here, one has to wonder, how did it erupt so much and potentially so violently that it not only formed the battle zone in a fairly short period of time, but also radically changed the Hisui region forever? Such activity would have needed to be rather intense, and given the condition of the rest of the region, and the likely time would have been needed to actually settle on the mainland, how did it occur so fast and seemingly out of nowhere? The latter point happens more often than you'd think, especially with underwater volcanism, where we cannot readily see brewing trouble, but the speed and likely repeated eruptions, that, I believe, can be linked to one Pokémon. I propose then that the true trigger source of these eruptions, the creation of Stark Mountain, and the end of the Hisui region as we know it, can be squarely blamed on one single Pokémon: Heatran.
Now, this might be a bit of a stretch to some, as while Heatran are indeed known to live inside the right type of volcanic structure for everything shown here, given this species' title, it is never really stated that they in any way can actually cause volcanoes to erupt, and since some Pokemon like Entei are said to have this power, it is a bit strange to then believe that it can cause these events to occur at all. They don't even learn eruption naturally, right? Well, turns out that isn't actually always the case.
In Pokemon Ranger Guardian Signs, there is a special RangerNet mission that involves the player character investigating the presence of a Heatran causing massive eruptions in the Oblivia region. And indeed, in said mission, the Heatran you encounter and eventually calm does have the move Eruption. But it gets better, as in the mission, you find out that it's causing the massive eruptions because it can't control the power. It is a move that Heatran are normally not supposed to be able to learn, and the fact that the beast can't control it more than shows. It can be said that this is just a one-off event, but there is one final nail in the coffin that helps bring it all together. They can breed! Yes, Heatran is really the only known legendary that actually exists in known male and female states, so it isn't that much of a leap to say that this instance was a case of a Heatran ending up with some sort of mutation that enabled it to use the move in some fashion. And if it can happen once, it can happen again, rare as the event might be. As such, the scenario of the repeated volcanic eruptions that made Stark Mountain and turned the Hisui region into Sinnoh being caused by a Heatran with eruption is one that not only makes sense, but is also a safe one to give sympathy for, as it may have been the offspring of the Heatran known to have once lived in Firespit Island, and simply couldn't control its powers. Perhaps even, it might have been aware of the threat it posed and tried to move northward underground in order to prevent a catastrophe, only for it to backfire and end up triggering the birth and formation of Stark Mountain. Even further, one could then possibly even say that the magma stone that is in Stark Mountain might have somehow allowed the creature to stabilize its power, and in turn is needed by it to keep itself from being able to use eruption further. But this last bit is not something I can prove right here, though it would explain why Buck's grandfather freaked out in the Generation 4 games when Buck took the stone from the mountain.
Either way, if this is truly the case, and that Heatran is the cause of it all, I suppose now we really do have a reason to consider the species legendary in status.
So, here we are now, with what I believe to be the true story of how the Hisui region became the Sinnoh region, through the emergence of a new active volcano that would eventually create the battle zone, and in turn was potentially caused by Heatran, unable to contain the power of eruption attacks. While I do not know if more information will come out that will either lend credence or invalidate the conclusions made in this analysis of the situation, I do think that the underlying geology of the entire region is something to take notice of, and clearly points to Hisui and Sinnoh being part of an ever-changing tectonic landscape that may only continue to change and evolve through time, with or without the aid of legendary Pokémon to force things along at a rapid pace.
Let us hope, though, that the Sinnoh region as it is today will hopefully remain more stable than the recent past, or the many people that have come to call the region home may be in for a rude awakening and a terrifying threat that may be impossible to prevent in the future. Merely prepared for, if the worst comes to blow, as another beast arrives to threaten the lives of all, from the smallest of Pokémon to the grandest of creatures, and the habitats that they call home. Thank you for watching this video. It brings me great joy to be able to speak to you all in the world each and every time we meet like this, to explore the many different facets of both the world of Pokemon as we know it, and the world as we live it, through every adventure we have with Pokemon by our side. If you'd like to, please subscribe, ring the bell and all that jazz, to keep yourself updated on content uploads and other materials of the like. You can also follow me on Twitter if you'd like to know right away when something new is uploaded, and my written works, from which most of this is based on, can be found on DeviantArt. Links to both can be found in the description down below. Remember that the world of Pokemon is a place full of wonder and mystery, and you never know what to expect. So, stay vigilant, keep watch, and always be prepared for the unexpected. Until next time, trainers and friends of all sorts, have a wonderful time.